Hello, students. We're back for another week of psychology of adult development. And so let me share my screen and I'll pull up this week's lecture. Okay. All right, let's see if I can make this big. Good. All right, so we're looking at chapter 2 in the book, and this chapter is on research methods in studying adults, okay, and specifically in your book it says aging in older adulthood, but we're going to talk about research that we can do with any groups in adulthood. Okay, so what's going on this week? I'm going to give this lecture, you're going to watch it, and then you'll listen to the important concepts that I present in this lecture and take some good notes, and then read chapter 2. I'm going to cover most of what's in chapter 2 today, so make sure you read the whole chapter, but kind of hone in on the concepts that I, concentrate on in this lecture. All right, due at the end of the week, we have 2 things this week, not just one. We have a second quiz for the course, and then we have a second discussion, okay? So you want to complete those before Sunday at 11:59 p.m. All right. Now, your book starts out by talking about theories and models that are related to adulthood, okay? And so we have something called meta theories or meta models explained in the book. These are kind of frameworks that researchers use to extract how to produce hypotheses, which are specific statements of predictions about behavior, the research design, so what kind of design are you going to use in your study? That kind of depends on the model or the theory that you're looking at. Also, it kind of constrains your sampling. In other words, what population are you going to pull your participants from in order to generalize their behavior to a population? And then the method used, okay? Those all flow from those meta theories or meta models, all right? Now, there are 3 meta models that are talked about in the text. The first is called mechanistic, and that's kind of based on environmental influences on the individual. So you can think of that as, if you're thinking of nature and nurture, this is kind of the nurture focus on, how people behave. There's the organismic meta model, and that has to do with the individual. And so this would be more of what an individual brings to the table in terms of nature, okay? So their genetics and their kind of internal psychology, okay? The third meta model is called contextual, and that kind of combines both the individual and the environment and kind of the interaction between the two. And so that is kind of nature and nurture mixed in a study. All right. Now, another idea that's presented right there at the beginning of the chapter is a perspective, and it's called the lifespan developmental perspective, produced by Baltes, okay? And that draws on all 3 meta models, but it's more kind of closely linked to the contextual meta model because it's looking at person environment and environment person interactions, okay? And so Baltes said that development is multifaceted. In other words, it has various, levels to it, and it's ongoing throughout adulthood. All right, now the book talks about the age variable in research. And so, when you're looking at adults or middle adults, younger adults, older adults, you want to kind of quantify or constrain what age means, okay? You can think about variables as being anything that varies, okay? And psychologists and other hard scientists study variables like, test scores or reaction time, performance on a task, or maybe personality traits, right? So, are individuals who are extroverted, um, become more introverted over adulthood? That could be one question that would look both at the individual and the environment. You know, what are environmental influences that would make you less social as you age, right? Maybe you were a child and you're very extroverted, very sociable, right? But as you progress through to adulthood and then moving through adulthood, are there environmental influences that kind of impact the individual on, their level of extroversion? So maybe when that person is an older adult, maybe environmental influences would cause them to kind of lose some of this sociability that they had, which was very extreme kind of in childhood, right? So these are variables that people can look at, psychologists can look at in studies. All right, now concerning age, we can look at age in categories like, who is introverted or extroverted in terms of age, male or female, those are categories, or continuous. Okay, so we can ask a person, how old are you? Okay, and they would just write down their age, and then we could take an average of all the people who are in our study in terms of their age. So that's kind of the continuous variable. Okay. Now, the age variable is usually set up as chronological. So we might have different age groups in a study. We might have younger adults and older adults, for example, or we could have younger adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. Okay, it depends on how the researcher sets up the study. Or, you know, we could look at years of age in groups. Okay, and so these grouped ages like 21 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 and older are actually categories that are mutually exclusive, right? In other words, you can't fit in all three, you can't fit in two, you can only fit in one and only one category. So usually age is looked at as a kind of categorical variable in most studies, all right? Now, the age variable is an organismic variable. You heard about tomato models, right? This is something that kind of comes with you, right? And we kind of set our age from zero to whatever, right? And so that is something that comes from not from your environment, but from inside of you, right? And so that's something that's within the nature of the individual. All right. Now, the book talks about factors in aging research, and there are three that we kind of have to look at to make sure that, we're not violating, the pureness of each of these factors. Now, a factor could be age, a factor could be a cohort, or a factor could be a time of measurement problem, okay? And these kind of impact the results in research studies. So you can think of age, like I said, in categories, your chronological age, usually, young, middle, or older adult, depending on the range of ages that you include in each one of those categories. Also, cohort is a factor. Now, what is a cohort? Well, you probably heard this term before, but maybe don't understand what it meant. Okay, some people were born in the 1960s. Okay, and they were, born about the same time. Maybe you have lots of people who were born in the 1960s, and they were not really viewers of the John F. Kennedy assassination because they would only be like 3, right? But they probably remembered during their childhood the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the assassination of Senator Kennedy, okay, Robert Kennedy in that case, and civil rights movement in the 60s and the Vietnam War in the 60s. And so they were influenced by all of these kind of historical and social variables, right? And they grew up during that time. And so that kind of defines, the way they act and behave. Okay. And so their cohort might behave differently when compared to people who were born, say, in the 1990s. Okay. And so, we can think of cohort effects that might go on in studies, and cohort is a factor that we have to take into account when we look at results of studies that talk about behaviors of different cohorts, okay, or age groups. That third factor, time of measurement, is interesting because if we test you at a particular time, let's say right now during the pandemic, right, your health, your work, and your family status might be different now than if we had tested you, say, 5 years ago, right, before the pandemic. Okay. The pandemic is kind of a strong environmental influence on the way our health operates and our work operates and also our family status. Okay. There are a lot of people who have been affected by the pandemic, and that is, they might have gotten sick, they might have lost their job, they might have quit their job, right, to take care of family at home, and this might have affected their economic, status, right? They might have lost money and, fallen on hard times, right? And so that all of those factors, the time of measurement might be different if we measured someone now versus say 5 years ago or 10 years from now, right? And so these are factors that you have to take into account when you read research results that have to do with adults. Okay. Now, in psychology, but especially in psychology of aging and developmental research, there are about 3 designs that are kind of used to look at people's behavior. Okay. One is called the cross-sectional design, and you see a lot of these in the literature that talk about behavior at one point in time. So it's kind of like taking a snapshot or a picture of a person's behavior at one time. A cross section, you can think of cutting a watermelon, right? And the middle, okay? And that's the only thing that you'll see is just what's happening right now. So we could study 2 or more age groups at one period in time, right? And that kind of study is really, it's cheap to do. You don't have to spend a lot of money for participants over time, right? You're just looking at them once. And it's more efficient than running a longitudinal study, which measures people's behaviors over time. Okay, now one problem that you'll see in cross-sectional research is, are the findings due to age differences or are the findings due to cohort differences? Okay, and also you need to take into account time of measurement, right? If we measure everybody right now during the pandemic, these age groups, right? I suppose they're all affected, right, by the pandemic problems that we have. But you have to think in terms also of cohorts. So if people grew up during a period where, we had other coronavirus kind of, epidemics like SARS, okay, I don't think you remember that, right? But that was a while ago. Then they may be able to adapt better to pandemic conditions than other people who have never experienced some kind of epidemic. Okay. All right. So that could be a cohort difference instead of an age difference. Okay. All right. So those are sectional designs that you see people's behavior at one point in time, and it's kind of a snapshot of their behavior. Okay. Now, other researchers who have grants and more money can sometimes turn a cross-sectional design into a longitudinal design. And so let's say that we do a study right now with a few age groups, and then we have the money or the grant funds to go ahead and recontact the original participants and have them undergo the same experimental conditions, say 10 years from now, okay? And then we can measure them again 10 years later, right? And so you might get three snapshots over time, but you're following people over time, okay? So the same individuals are followed over time and tested at two or more occasions, okay? That's kind of the longitudinal research design. All right, we can find age-related changes in those studies because you're looking at the same individuals, right? 1, 2, and 3 points in time or whatever it may be. And then you can see what happens when people become older, okay? Does their behavior change? And these are the same individuals, okay? Now, some of the problems with the longitudinal design are, I guess, are practice effects, okay? And so if you give me a battery of tests at one point in time, maybe 10 years later, you give the same battery of tests, then I may remember, right, the test that I took the first time, and maybe I could, increase my performances based on my memory for the original tests, okay? This is called a practice effect, okay? If you give people the same test over and over and over again, they might just become better on those tests than if you gave them different tests. But you have to give them the same test in a longitudinal design. You get the same kind of results each time, right? Okay. Another problem with longitudinal designs, and this is a big one, sometimes the original participants don't want to be contacted again to do the study, okay? And so they'll be called dropouts, okay? This is called attrition. So maybe you have 500 individuals in the first study, but then say 100 of those people don't want to participate again in your study. And so now you only have 400 at the second point of measurement, okay? And then again, if you're going to, contact them again to do the study 10 years later or 5 years later, you may only have 200 of the original 500 participants. Okay, so this is called attrition. You lose people over time who, are just disinterested or maybe they passed away, right? Or something like that. So these are a couple of major research designs in developmental psychology, and especially in psychology of adulthood and aging, okay? Now, how to solve the problems in both of the cross-sectional and longitudinal designs? Well, researchers have come up with a kind of a mixture of the two, okay? It's called a sequential design, and it combines both the cross-sectional and the longitudinal design, but you're looking at groups that start the study at various times, okay? So if you look at the chart that I made here, maybe a person was born in 1980 and then, we test them the first time in the year 2000 and they're 20 years old, right? And then we test them again in 2010 and they're 30 years old, etc. You can see right here in the table how that works. And then during the first, part of your research study in 2000, you might have also people who were born in 1990, and they would be 10 years old at that time, right? They would be 20 in 2010, they'd be 30 in 2020, etc. Okay. So now you're getting people from different cohorts who join your study, and then you can kind of look at their behaviors, the differences or similarities in their behaviors over each snapshot in the longitudinal design, okay? And so this eliminates cohort effects because people, were born in different cohorts. And you're also eliminating time of measurement problems because maybe the pandemic starts in, when was it, 2020 or something like that? Well, we tested people in 2000 and 2010, and then during the pandemic, and then 10 years later, I don't know if the pandemic will ever end, but maybe in 2030 it will. And so you can see kind of changes in behavior through between each of these age groups over time. And that's called a sequential design. Okay, now overall, and in your book, the book talks about three different main methods that we use in psychology, and you can think of them as DCE, okay, descriptive, correlational, and experimental. So I'll just make a brief description of these before we go. Descriptive research is a way to kind of observe behaviors of people, or we can interview people about, what they're thinking, or, their beliefs or behaviors or attitudes. We can also use focus groups to look at how a group of people view some kind of problem. And we can use surveys and scales in descriptive research. So there are lots of different, tools that we can use to describe people's thoughts and behaviors, okay? So from the results of those, let's say we get interview transcripts, right, from people, we can then describe what they've said in those interviews. We can also, if we're doing an observation of people, say at work or at play, we can describe the behaviors that we observe, right? And so we can write a journal article just based on the descriptions of thoughts and behaviors that we witness, okay? Now, we can't really say that something causes something else to happen, because in descriptive research, you might, collect a few numbers, say from a survey or a scale, but you're not really, experimentally manipulating a variable, okay? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But here in descriptive research, we usually just describe in words, rich descriptions of what we have witnessed, okay, in terms of our sample. Now, it seems that in your book, correlation is kind of listed under descriptive research, and I suppose it's there for a reason. That is, a correlational study also does not provide cause and effect information. In correlations, people just look at relationships between variables, okay? And so, it describes a couple of different kinds of correlations that one might find in a research study, okay? This slide shows a positive correlation between two variables, okay? So let's get age and reaction time in a study, and maybe we measure, we ask people to report their age, and then we measure someone on, let's say, a driving simulation where they're stepping on the brake. How fast do they do that when they see some kind of, maybe a person walking out in front of the car that they're driving, okay? And so we could measure their reaction time to that kind of event. And then we measure all participants the same way, and we ask them to report their age. And maybe, maybe we would find that as age increases, reaction time also increases. In other words, we might have faster reaction times when we're younger, and then slower reaction times when we're older, okay? So I just, made up these data to kind of show you how it would plot out on something called a scatter plot here on the slide. And you can see that that little bar, the average line between the data there, the data points, right, shows kind of an increasing line, okay? And we would call this a positive correlation. I even ran these data in a program that's called SPSS software, okay? And you can run a correlation and find an R value, okay? That's a value called a Pearson correlation, okay? And you would find that in a positive correlation, you're going to have a positive R, okay? The correlation coefficient. You're going to have a positive one. So in this case, with my made up data, I had an almost perfect correlation because a perfect correlation would be 1.0, right? And a perfect negative correlation would be negative 1.0. And then somewhere in the middle would be 0. Okay, so correlations range from -1 to +1. Okay, and that's the way they work. Now, in your book, they talk about negative correlations too. So I just made up an example for you to look at here on this slide. You can see that in contrast to the last slide, the averaged trend line going through the data on this scatter plot that I've shown goes down. Okay, so it kind of goes down. So in a negative correlation, as one variable increases, the other variable that you're measuring will decrease. Okay, so you've got one going up and one going down. Now, what's the example that I used here? Well, this may be a stereotype or not, but let's just say we have people of different ages from age 32 to 70 in the study. And then we measured with some kind of test their short-term memory. Okay, so we give them strings of digits to we read those to them, and then we wait a second and we ask them to repeat the string of digits that we just gave them, okay? And that's kind of like a test of short-term memory. If people, I don't know, gave you a phone number and they said 575-672-1273, okay? How many of those numbers would you remember, okay? And how many would you repeat back to a person after about 20 to 30 seconds or something like that? Okay, that's your short-term memory working there. You're not working or coming up with a strategy to remember the number, right? You're just kind of spitting out the same numbers that you heard that are just held in a short-term passive storage system, okay? And so we could study these people ages 32 to 70, and then we would get some kind of short-term memory result, okay? And we would record each one of those, just like I did in this little table on the left, okay? And then we take those pairs of scores and we put them in this statistical program called SPSS. And the result that I got just with my made up numbers was a negative number this time, okay? So the R, the correlation coefficient, is negative 0.709, okay? Or if you rounded that to 2 decimal places, it would be negative 0.71, okay? And that would be the correlation coefficient that we would report in our journal article, okay? Looking at age and its relationship to short-term memory, okay? Now, the third type of research method that we use in psychology studies is called the experimental method, okay? We can determine cause and effect in those kinds of studies, okay? We identify what's called an independent variable. You probably heard some of these words in past science courses or in your introductory to psychology course. And an independent variable is something that the researcher manipulates, okay? So I could have, I don't know, I could randomly place some people in one group and some people in a second group, and then I could measure their behavior, okay? So let's say I randomly sampled you to watch a video that was kind of violent, okay? And everybody in that group watched a violent video. And then the second group are sampled into that group just randomly, and they watch a video of a waterfall, okay, just flowing, water coming down, okay? And so that's the independent variable. You have two levels. One is watch violent video, one is watch neutral video. And then the researcher will measure something after that, okay? The measured variable or the dependent variable might be your level of aggression, okay, after watching one of those types of videos. And so you might find that people who watch kind of a violent video will probably act more aggressively than if they were to watch a neutral video, okay? And so the independent variable again is the type of video you watched, okay, either violent or nonviolent. And then afterward, we measure your level of aggressiveness, which would be the dependent variable. Okay, you probably heard of these things before, right? Now, a sample is what we usually draw from a population. So let's say that we numbered every name in a population, let's say in a, I don't know, in a grade school or in a work environment. We got all the people's names that either go to that school or they work at that place, and we put a number next to their name. Okay. Now, maybe we don't have enough money to give to a big number of people, but maybe we can pay 100 people at the school or at the work environment, maybe $10 each. And so we can use $1,000 to run 100 people in a study. That's our sample, okay? And so we're kind of constrained by, I guess, the money that we have to do the research. But let's say there are 1,000 people in the school, and we can only draw a sample of 100. And so what we do is we use a random number generator to pull names from that big list as our sample, okay? And they will be randomly sampled because we're just randomizing numbers from that, population. So that's called a sample, all right? So that's important in an experimental study. Now, after we run them in this study, they watch a violent video or a neutral video, and then we measure their level of aggressiveness, then we can conduct some statistical tests to find out whether people who were randomly assigned to the violent video, to watch that violent video, had a higher average aggressiveness than people who watched the neutral video. Okay, and we can do a statistical test. It's called a t-test to see if there are average differences or mean differences in what we find, okay? And then we go ahead and we publish our paper or we go out to a conference in psychology and we present our findings. That's called disseminating the results, okay? All right, so that's all I have for this week. Remember, we have quiz 2 and discussion board 2. And, I'd like you to complete those after reading chapter 2 this week, okay? All right, so everyone have a good week, and I'll see you next time for some more stuff, okay? All right, take care this week.